When my sister exposed my $12 million secret at Thanksgiving and my family demanded everything. Hello, everyone. Most of you watch these stories all the way through, but many forget to hit subscribe. It's free, it motivates me, and it makes sure you never miss the next big twist. So subscribe now, and let's get into the story. Thanksgiving. The air in the dining room felt heavy even before anything went wrong. The kind of heaviness that presses down on your chest when people who share blood but not peace are forced into the same space, pretending for a few hours that the word family is enough to cover over decades of old wounds, whispered resentments, and unspoken rivalries. And as I sat at the long oak table, polished to a shine that reflected the warm glow of the chandelier overhead, I scanned the faces around me, my father at the head of the table with his usual stiff posture, my mother fluttering between seats with her endless fussing, my older brother already loosening his tie as though this gathering were just another formality, my sister with her restless hands and sharp tongue, the cousins whispering in a corner like they always did, and the in-laws, who observed everything with that mixture of politeness and quiet judgment that outsiders bring to old family rituals. And, I told myself, as I had told myself every Thanksgiving for years, to just survive the night, smile at the right stories, laugh at the jokes I had heard 100 times, and let the hours pass without incident. The turkey sat steaming in the center of the table, surrounded by the parade of dishes. My mother insisted on preparing herself even though everyone offered to help. Mashed potatoes whipped smooth with too much butter, stuffing perfumed with sage, green beans drowning in cream, cranberry sauce glistening in its ridiculous molded shape, all of it giving off the illusion of abundance, of tradition, of harmony. But beneath it all I could feel the tension simmering, because families like mine never gather without friction, never sit in one room without the threat of someone saying the wrong thing, dredging up old grievances, or starting a fight over who sacrificed more and who failed to measure up. I had been careful for years, meticulous, building walls around my private life and especially around the secret I carried, the fortune I had earned through long nights, risky choices, and the kind of stubborn willpower that no one at this table had ever seen in me before, and I kept it hidden because I knew, deep in my bones, that if they ever found out, they wouldn't see it as my success but as their entitlement. My plan had been simple: keep my head down, keep my wealth silent, and let them think of me however they wished. Quiet, distant, maybe even a little selfish because it was safer than opening the vault of truth. But plans, like all illusions, crumble at the smallest crack, and mine shattered the moment my sister, forever reckless and careless with words, reached across the table for her buzzing phone, squinting at the glowing screen, and in her sing-song voice that had been annoying me since childhood blurted out, "Wow, I didn't know you had $12 million just sitting in that account." The words dropped like a hammer, heavy and impossible to ignore, and I swear the room stopped breathing for a second. Forks hovered in midair, my father's knife froze above the turkey breast, my mother's hand went to her throat as if she had been stabbed, and even the children, who, until that moment had been giggling and sneaking olives off the platter, fell silent as though they instinctively knew a line had been crossed. My sister's eyes widened the moment she realized what she had said, but the damage was already done, the secret already out, and I felt my stomach churn as every head turned toward me, some faces filled with shock, some narrowing with suspicion, and others already calculating what my supposed fortune might mean for them. My father was the first to break the silence, setting down his glass with a deliberate thud that echoed louder than it should have, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward, the authority in his voice sharp as he demanded, "What is she talking about?" My mother's lips parted, trembling as though she were about to scold me like a child, her eyes glistening with a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride, and my brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his jaws as though already planning how he could corner me later, away from the crowd to ask his questions. The cousins exchanged quick glances, whispers snaking around them like smoke, while the in-laws sat straighter, suddenly more alert, their expressions caught between curiosity and judgment. My sister, realizing too late the gravity of what she had done, stammered, trying to backtrack, insisting maybe she misread, maybe it wasn't what it sounded like, but her weak attempt at retreat only made the silence heavier. the stares sharper, and I knew there was no undoing this. The room had shifted, the air had turned from festive to electric, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding louder than the faint clatter of a fork dropping onto a plate somewhere down the table. I opened my mouth, searching for words that might deflect, minimize or soften the blow, but all I managed was a brittle smile and a weak murmur that this wasn't the right time to talk about money. Though, even as I said it, I knew it was useless, because the right time no longer existed. The wrong time had already exploded into being. My father cleared his throat, the deep, commanding sound he used when preparing to lecture us all, and I felt the familiar weight of childhood return, that suffocating pressure of always being the one on trial. My mother shook her head slowly, as though mourning not the money but the betrayal of secrecy. My brother leaned back, crossing his arms, his silence heavier than any words, while my cousins leaned closer, eager for the spectacle. My sister, cheeks flushed, tried to sip her wine casually, as though drowning herself in Merlot might erase the revelation, but she couldn't meet my eyes. And I sat there, pinned under their collective gaze, realizing that the dinner I had hoped to endure quietly had become the opening scene of a war not fought with weapons but with accusations, demands, and the unmasking of every fragile bond we had pretended was unbreakable. In that instant, I knew two things. First, that nothing about this Thanksgiving would ever resemble the forced gratitude of the past, and second, that the truth about who my family really was would finally come clawing to the surface, uglier and more vicious than I had ever dared imagine. By the way, I'm curious, from where are you watching this video? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing the community grow. The silence at the table had been suffocating, but the silence inside me, the one I had carried for years, was heavier still, and as their eyes bored into me, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give, my mind slid backward through time, through the winding, lonely road that had led me to the fortune they now regarded as a crime. And it struck me how strange it was that the story of $12 million wasn't one of inheritance, or blind luck, but of years when no one at this very table believed in me. When every attempt I made to stand on my own was met with laughter, doubt, or thinly veiled contempt. I remembered being the quiet one, the one who never quite fit, the one who never had the right clothes or the right words, the one my father dismissed as soft and my brother mocked as aimless, and I remembered the nights spent working 2 jobs while they slept, the afternoons when I skipped meals to pay for courses no one thought were worth taking, the years when I listened to everyone tell me that the dreams I nursed were impractical, foolish, doomed. I didn't stumble into wealth. I built it, brick by brick, through choices they wouldn't have understood even if I tried to explain. It began almost accidentally with a few $100s scraped together from freelance gigs, invested not in the shiny things everyone else wanted but in opportunities most people mocked, early shares in companies my father had never heard of, cryptocurrencies my brother called fake money, property in neighborhoods my mother swore would never improve. I taught myself everything, alone, reading until dawn, failing, losing, starting over, and when the first small success came when one of those fake coins surged. When one rundown house I bought doubled in value, it wasn't celebration I felt but quiet validation. The proof that I wasn't the fool they said I was. But I kept silent because I knew silence was safer than confession. With silence, no one could guilt me into sharing. No one could twist my victories into obligations. No one could reduce years of sleepless nights into just luck. I reinvested. Always reinvested, turning thousands into tens of thousands, then into hundreds of thousands, until the zeros lined up in a way that felt unreal even to me, and yet still I told no one. I lived simply, deliberately unremarkable, driving the same car I had owned for years, renting instead of buying a mansion, wearing clothes that didn't hint at anything more than average, because wealth, when known, attracts vultures, and vultures often look like family. I remembered one particular Christmas when my brother, drunk and smug, told me I'd never amount to anything, that I'd always be the one asking for help, and I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, because by then my accounts already held more than he'd ever earned in a lifetime. I remembered my mother sighing about how I hadn't given her grandchildren yet, how I didn't own a house, how I must be behind in life. And I nodded, smiled, let her pity wash over me, all the while knowing I could buy 3 houses in cash if I wanted. But what good would that do except shift her sighs into demands? My father never asked how I was, only why I wasn't more like my brother. More assertive, more traditional, more of a man in his narrow definition, and every time he said it, I wanted to throw my bank statements across the table and watch the smugness drain from his face. But instead I swallowed the urge and kept my secret. Because my wealth wasn't theirs, and I knew the second they caught a whiff of it, they would circle me like wolves, tearing apart the life I had built with claws of entitlement. And now, thanks to my sister's careless mouth, the wolves had been unleashed, and I could already see the hunger flickering in their eyes. But as I sat there, I thought back to those long nights, hunched over a second-hand laptop in an apartment that smelled of mildew, scouring forums, analyzing trends, teaching myself what no one else bothered to teach me, and I felt a flicker of pride even in the dread, because the truth was, I had made something of myself without their approval, without their help, without their faith. $12 million wasn't just money, it was proof. A fortress built out of every insult, every dismissal, every time they had written me off, and though I dreaded what they would do with the knowledge of it, I couldn't erase the fact that it was mine, hard-won, defended in silence, and now exposed at the worst possible moment, laid bare under the harsh glow of a chandelier and the sharper glow of family judgment. The moment the words settled into the air, heavy and unmovable, the room shifted into something unrecognizable. The polite facade of Thanksgiving crumbling into a raw arena where every suppressed emotion, every buried resentment, and every greed-fueled thought clawed its way to the surface. And though I tried to hold myself still, tried to pretend the revelation was just a misunderstanding, the storm broke too quickly, beginning with my father, whose voice, deep and booming, sliced through the silence as he demanded to know how long I had been hiding something like that from the people who had raised me, as though I owed him not just my obedience, but also every cent I had scraped together without his help. And before I could even form a response, my mother chimed in, her voice trembling with the wounded sharpness of a martyr, saying she couldn't believe her own child would keep a fortune like that a secret while she struggled to keep the house repaired, while she clipped coupons and stretched meals, as though my silence had been an act of cruelty instead of an act of survival, and her words ignited my brother, who slammed his palm on the table, rattling the silverware, sneering that it all made sense now, that it explained why I never asked for help, why I always seemed so detached, why I didn't carry my weight in the family's obligations. And though his words dripped with accusation, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the greedy spark of a man drowning in debt who suddenly saw a lifeline dangling in front of him. My sister, still flushed from the slip of her tongue, tried to laugh nervously, saying she was only joking, that maybe she misread something on the shared account notification, but no one was listening to her anymore. The fire she had lit had already taken over the room, and every gaze was locked on me. My cousins leaned forward with wide eyes, some with barely concealed excitement, others with envy, their whispers now a chorus of speculation about how I had done it, about whether it was real, about whether I was lying to protect something bigger, and the in-laws, who had always kept a careful distance from family drama, now leaned in with interest, their expressions a careful mix of judgment and curiosity, as though they were deciding whether I was selfish or simply smart. My father, pounding his fork against his plate for order, said it was time for me to come clean about what I had, where it came from, and what I intended to do for the family. And when I opened my mouth to explain, to try and steady the rising storm with reason, my brother cut me off, saying it didn't matter how I got it. What mattered was that I had been hoarding it, keeping it from the very people who would have used it better, and the hypocrisy of his words made my stomach turn. Because this was the same brother who had mocked me when I was scraping together pennies, the same brother who had once told me I was destined to be nothing. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered that she couldn't believe I'd let her suffer through so much stress about bills while I had been sitting on millions, and her words stung because I remembered every time she had brushed off my own struggles, every time she had dismissed my exhaustion, every time she had told me to be more like my brother. My father leaned back, stroking his chin, and I could almost see him calculating, deciding how much control he still had over me, while my sister, sensing the anger shifting toward her for exposing the secret, tried to redirect, saying it wasn't her fault, that I should have been honest, that families shouldn't keep secrets like this. And in that moment, all the masks fell. My father's mask of authority crumbled into greed. My mother's mask of nurturing cracked into manipulation. My brother's mask of confidence slipped into desperation. And my sister's mask of innocence twisted into justification. And I realized that the Thanksgiving table wasn't just splintering. It was turning into a tribunal, with me as the accused, guilty of success, guilty of independence, guilty of not needing them. The demands began quietly at first, my mother asking what I could do to help ease the family's burdens, my father insisting that if I really cared, I'd invest in my brother's failing business, my sister chirping that I could at least pay off her student loans since she had always looked out for me. But then the floodgates opened, voices overlapping, accusations flung like knives, and suddenly everyone had a request: college funds, mortgages, medical bills, vacations, debt consolidation, all spilling out like a shopping list of entitlements, and the sheer volume of it made my head spin. I sat there, staring at the plates of food now going cold, the turkey carved but untouched, the mashed potatoes forming a crust, and I thought how surreal it was that in the space of 10 minutes, gratitude had been replaced by greed, love had been replaced by ledger books, and family had been reduced to creditors circling a debtor. I wanted to scream, to remind them that none of them had believed in me. None of them had lifted a finger to help me climb out of the hole I once lived in. None of them had been there on those nights when I gambled everything I had on a risky move and prayed I wouldn't end up broke. But my voice felt trapped in my throat, silenced not by guilt but by the sheer weight of betrayal pressing in from all sides. And in that suffocating moment, I understood with brutal clarity that the discovery of my wealth hadn't just changed the conversation. It had exposed the truth that to them I wasn't a son, a brother, or a cousin anymore. I was a bank account, a jackpot, a resource to be mined until nothing was left. And the family I had feared would never understand me had just proven me right in the cruelest way possible. As their voices rose around me, each demand layering over the last until the noise felt like a swarm of bees crawling under my skin, I realized that this moment, this eruption over $12 million, was not born entirely of greed, but of something older, festering beneath the surface for years, maybe decades. And as I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the sheen of gravy on my plate as though it might distract me from the fury around me, my mind was pulled backward into the archive of memories I had tried to bury, each one explaining why this family would never see my fortune as mine, why they would never recognize my success as separate from their entitlement. I remembered being 8 years old, tugging at my father's sleeve after dinner, excited to show him the drawings I had made of little business ideas, lemonade stands that weren't just about lemonade but about expansion, branding, efficiency, childish but imaginative. And he barely looked before shoving the papers aside and telling me to focus on real work, the kind my brother excelled at: sports, chores, anything that showed strength. And I learned that night that ideas weren't worth much in this house unless they came with muscles or medals. I remembered my sister, a teenager then, borrowing money from me when I had saved from mowing lawns, promising to pay it back. And when she never did, she laughed in my face, saying it was just family, that debts didn't count between siblings, and though I smiled then to keep the peace, something in me hardened at the thought that my effort could be dismissed so casually. I remembered my mother's sighs, endless sighs, as though my existence were a disappointment she bore quietly, her comments disguised as advice. If only you were more like your brother, if only you didn't dream so much, if only you settled down instead of wasting time on impossible projects. And each sigh was a pinprick, small but cumulative, until they formed a net around me that I longed to escape. I remembered family gatherings where my cousins paraded scholarships and promotions, while my father beamed at them like proud royalty. And when my turn came, when I said I was freelancing, building something of my own, the silence that followed was more cutting than any insult. A silence that screamed failure, delusion, shame. Even now, sitting at that Thanksgiving table years later, I could see the echoes of those moments in their faces. My father's disappointment hardened into authority. My mother's sighs sharpened into guilt. My sister's mockery matured into deflection. My brother's competitiveness twisted into resentment. And it struck me with a bitter clarity that this fight wasn't just about $12 million. It was about every time they had underestimated me, every chance they had taken to remind me I was lesser, every time they had written me off. And now, faced with proof that I had outgrown their expectations, they couldn't accept it without demanding a piece of it. The past clawed through the present, each memory fueling their sense of justification. My mother muttering that she had sacrificed her youth for us and deserved some comfort now. My father growling that family wealth should be shared. My brother snapping that if I had spoken up sooner, maybe we wouldn't have lost so much time. My sister insisting that honesty would have spared us this pain. I wanted to tell them that honesty had never been safe in this house. That truth was always a weapon turned against the one who dared to speak it. That I had learned early on to swallow my victories as quietly as I swallowed my failures. And as they circled me with their demands, I remembered all the times they had left me to fend for myself. The winter my heat was cut off, and I huddled in blankets while they celebrated holidays without noticing my absence. The year I lost my job and no one called to ask if I was okay. The months when I worked 3 shifts and they mocked me for looking tired. All the while I told myself family meant something deeper. That blood would matter in the end, but here it was, exposed in its truest form, not love, not loyalty, but leverage. My cousins whispered that maybe I should set up a trust. My uncle half joked that I could pay off everyone's mortgage and barely notice it. My father said a real man would provide for his family, and my mother's eyes, wet and pleading, said that I owed her peace in her old age. And I realized with a hollow ache that they weren't asking, they were already expecting. Rewriting history in their minds to cast me not as the black sheep, but as the prodigal son whose success was theirs by right. Every flashback, every wound, every betrayal suddenly aligned with this moment, and it was so clear to me it hurt. The money hadn't changed them, it had revealed them, stripped away the thin veil of family niceties to show the raw machinery underneath. A machinery that had always been grinding, always measuring love against usefulness, always preparing to devour whoever strayed out of line. I sat there, my fork untouched, the food cooling to tasteless lumps, and I thought about how strange it was that the fortune I had built to secure freedom had chained me tighter to the very people I had hoped to escape, and I wondered whether this was inevitable all along, whether no amount of secrecy could have protected me from the truth of who they really were. The tension that had been simmering now erupted into a full boil, and what began as subtle insinuations transformed into outright demands, each voice clawing over the others until the dining room no longer resembled a Thanksgiving gathering, but a hostile negotiation chamber where I sat as both defendant and prize. My fortune the only thing anyone could see, and as I tried to steady my breathing, my father leaned forward, pounding the table with the flat of his hand, his tone thunderous as he declared that I had a responsibility. Not a choice, to give back to the family, reminding me in excruciating detail of every roof he had patched, every meal he had put on the table, every lecture he had delivered about hard work, each example twisted into evidence that the wealth I had accumulated somehow belonged not to me, but to him, as though fatherhood had been an investment in my future dividends rather than an act of love. My mother's voice wove over his, softer but sharper in its way, a tremble of feigned hurt as she listed her sacrifices. The nights she stayed up sick with worry when I came home late from jobs. The years she claimed she had held the family together while everyone else took advantage. And then, with a practiced quiver in her voice, she asked how I could let her grow old without comfort, without security, when I had the means to give her a life she deserved. And her words struck not because they were true, but because I could see the others nodding, feeding off her performance, believing her guilt as justification for their greed. My brother, unable to hold back any longer, slammed his fork down so hard it clattered against the plate, his voice thick with resentment as he accused me of being selfish, of letting him struggle while I watched from the sidelines with millions, reminding me of his mounting debts, his crumbling business, and insisting that if I had been honest, he could have avoided disaster, could have turned his life around, all while glaring at me as though my secrecy had been the root of his failures. My sister, emboldened now that the weight of blame had shifted entirely onto me, leaned in with her wineglass half raised, her words dripping with false sweetness as she suggested I could at least help with her student loans, since she had always defended me when others mocked me, a claim so hollow I almost laughed, but her tone sharpened quickly into accusation, saying I had betrayed her by letting her live with financial stress while I sat comfortable. And as her words echoed, the cousins began chiming in, first as whispers, then louder, with suggestions that I could set up a family trust, that I could cover everyone's mortgage, that I could pay off medical bills and college tuition and still barely notice, their voices a rising tide of entitlement that made my chest ache. Even the in-laws, who had remained quiet until now, added their own barbed remarks, half-jokes about how generosity was the true test of character, thinly veiled prods to see if the supposed fortune could stretch beyond bloodlines. And in that moment I realized that the circle had tightened, that there was no ally at the table, no one willing to speak up in my defense, no one who saw me as anything other than an open vault. The manipulation grew more sinister, my father insisting that if I refused, it would prove I never cared about this family, my mother gasping that she would not live to see her children divided, my brother warning that secrets had a way of ruining reputations, and my sister, ever theatrical, muttering that she wished she had never said anything, not because she regretted the slip, but because she regretted not getting her piece of the pie sooner. I felt their words closing in on me, heavy as chains, and I realized that this wasn't negotiation, it was siege, a coordinated assault dressed in the language of family loyalty. And I sat there staring at the cold turkey, the congealed gravy, the candles flickering in pools of wax, and I thought how absurd it was that this night, meant to celebrate gratitude, had turned into a grotesque auction where my love was being priced, my worth measured in dollars, and every memory we shared rewritten into evidence that I owed them everything. When the shouting dulled into tense murmurs and the clatter of silverware gave way to the soft hum of whispered conspiracies, I found myself retreating inward, though my body was still trapped at that table, hemmed in by the very people who claimed to love me, their faces blurring together into a single wall of expectation, and I realized that, though I sat in a room full of family, I had never felt more alone in my life, because every glance I met wasn't the glance of a father to a son, or a mother to her child, or a sibling to their equal. It was the stare of a creditor to a debtor, cold, evaluative, measuring how much they could take before I broke. The isolation pressed in tighter when my father leaned back with that smug certainty he wore when he believed he had cornered me, telling me I was too soft to say no, that I would come around because family was family and duty was duty. And when my mother placed her trembling hand on mine, her voice dripping with guilt as she whispered that she had given me life, how could I deny her peace in her final years? I felt the trap close further, a velvet cage disguised as love. My brother muttered darkly about debts that needed paying, debts that could destroy him if I didn't step in, and my sister, ever manipulative, sighed theatrically, saying she couldn't believe she had defended me all those years only to discover I had been hoarding wealth in silence. And though their words stabbed, it was the silence from everyone else that cut deepest, the cousins, the in-laws, the nieces and nephews who looked at me with wide, expectant eyes, none of them stepping in to remind the room that I owed them nothing, none of them seeing me as anything but an opportunity. In that suffocating quiet between demands, I turned inward, my mind unraveling years of choices, sacrifices, and secrets, and I thought about what family had always meant to me, had it ever been love, or had it always been obligation dressed up in holiday dinners and birthday gifts, obligation reinforced with sighs and glares and guilt. I thought about the nights I sat alone in my tiny apartment, eating canned soup by the glow of my laptop, building the fortune they now salivated over, and how no one was there then to ease my burdens, how no one called to ask if I had eaten, how no one offered to pay my rent when I faced eviction notices. And I realized that love, if it had ever existed here, had been conditional all along, conditional on what I could give, conditional on what I could provide, and that the money hadn't changed them, it had revealed them, stripped bare every false layer of warmth to show the greed beneath. My hands trembled under the table. Not from fear of losing the money, but from the dawning understanding that in keeping my secret, I had been right all along, that silence had been my shield. And now that shield had been ripped away, they no longer saw me, only the vault they thought they had discovered. The isolation wrapped around me like a cloak, heavy, suffocating, and yet, in the middle of it, a strange clarity emerged. The clarity of a man who finally sees his family not through the haze of tradition, but through the lens of truth. And though the weight of their expectations crushed me, part of me felt a grim strength rising, a knowledge that if I didn't draw boundaries now, if I didn't protect myself, there would be nothing left of me to salvage. And tell me, what kind of story should I cover next? Family drama, revenge, or secrets revealed? Comment your choice below, and maybe your idea will be the next upload. The air in the room had grown so thick with accusation, guilt, and manipulation that I could barely breathe. And as the voices rose once more, overlapping in a cacophony of demands and grievances, I felt something inside me snap, not in anger at first, but in exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that came from years of swallowing my pride, of staying silent while they dismissed me, of pretending their approval mattered more than my peace, and now, with their hands practically reaching across the table to claw at what I had built, that exhaustion hardened into something sharper, something unmovable, and I realized the breaking point wasn't coming, it was here. My father leaned forward again, his voice booming with that false authority he wielded like a weapon, declaring that if I didn't step up, if I didn't prove my loyalty by funding my brother's failing business and securing my mother's comfort, then I was no son of his. And the words, though heavy, slid off me like water, because for the first time in my life, I saw him not as a father, but as a man demanding payment for a debt I never owed. My mother's sobs grew louder, shaking her shoulders as she whispered that she had sacrificed everything for me, that her sleepless nights and wrinkled hands had earned her the right to be cared for, and though part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her, the larger part recognized the performance for what it was. A knife of guilt slipped between my ribs. My brother, face red with anger and desperation, shouted that he had carried the family name, that he had been the golden child until now, and that if I didn't share, I was spitting on the very bloodline that gave me life, and his words, meant to shame me, only reminded me of every time he had mocked me when I struggled, every time he had sneered at my choices, every time he had been so certain I would never amount to anything. My sister, emboldened by the chaos, accused me of betrayal, of letting her drown in debt while I lounged in luxury, painting a picture of me as a miser hoarding wealth while my own blood suffered. And though the lies stung, the absurdity of it struck me harder, because I had lived simply, quietly, never flaunting a thing, never asking for help, never taking from them, and now my very silence was being twisted into cruelty. The table had become a courtroom, the verdict already decided, the punishment already written. I was guilty of independence, guilty of secrecy, guilty of not sharing what I had bled for, and they were ready to strip me bare in the name of love. My heart pounded, my hands clenched under the table, and I felt the last thread of patience fray until finally, when my father slammed his fist and demanded again that I speak, that I promised to give, I lifted my head and met his eyes, and the room fell silent, every voice stilled by the unfamiliar steel in mine as I said, clear and steady, that I owed them nothing. The words shocked even me as they left my mouth, but once spoken, they became a flood, years of swallowed truths pouring out as I told them I had built my life alone, that not one of them had believed in me, not one of them had helped when I needed it, that every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night, every risk had been mine alone, and that the money was mine, not a family asset, not a shared inheritance, but the result of my blood, my sweat, my choices. Their faces twisted in disbelief, in outrage and wounded pride, and I pressed on, telling my brother that his failures were his own, that my sister's debts were her responsibility, that my parents' sacrifices, however real, had never been investments in my future wealth. And as the words filled the room, I felt something break not me, but the illusion that this family could ever see me as anything but a resource to exploit. My mother gasped, clutching her chest. My father's face reddened with fury, my brother cursed under his breath, and my sister slammed her glass down so hard it cracked, but I didn't waver, Because the breaking point wasn't about anger anymore, it was about liberation, about finally refusing to be consumed by a family that had never truly seen me. The silence that followed was deafening, each of them processing that the vault they thought they had cracked open had slammed shut instead. And in that silence I realized that though I had drawn a line, I had also severed something permanent, that after tonight, nothing about this family would ever be the same. The silence that followed my words stretched longer than any pause I had ever endured at that table, a silence that wasn't empty but heavy with shock, outrage, and the crumbling of illusions. And as I sat there, staring at faces twisted with disbelief and simmering fury, I felt the truth settle into my chest like a stone. Whatever we had pretended to be as a family had ended in that moment, replaced not with reconciliation but with exposure, the raw unveiling of what had always been there, but hidden beneath holiday rituals and polite small talk. My father was the first to break, his voice low but sharp, muttering that if I walked out of this house without agreeing to support them, I was no son of his, and though his words once would have cut me to the bone, now they fell flat, brittle echoes of authority that no longer bound me. My mother's tears came next, streaming down her face as she whispered that I was heartless, that I had turned cold, that she had raised me only to be abandoned in her old age. And though guilt pricked at the edges of my resolve, I recognized the performance, the manipulation that had dressed itself as love for so many years, and I refused to bow beneath it. My brother cursed me outright, his face twisted in rage as he declared that I was selfish, ungrateful, a disgrace, and my sister, drunk on both wine and resentment, shouted that I had ruined everything, that by keeping secrets I had destroyed the bonds of trust, as if those bonds had ever been strong enough to withstand the weight of truth. The cousins whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, others smirking as though they had always expected me to fail at being part of this family, while the in-laws shifted uncomfortably, already calculating how to distance themselves from the fallout, because no one wanted to be caught in the middle of a war that had nothing to do with them but promised to burn everyone nearby. And yet, as their accusations rained down, I felt strangely calm, as though by finally speaking, by finally refusing to be consumed, I had freed myself from a prison I hadn't realized I was still living in. And the calmness carried me as I pushed back my chair, the screech of wood against tile louder than any of their voices, and stood. I told them, with a steadiness I didn't know I had, that I loved them in the way one loves the past, but I would no longer allow myself to be devoured in the name of family, that my life, my work, my fortune were mine alone, not bargaining chips, not inheritances, not communal property, and though my words sparked gasps and furious protests, I didn't flinch. I walked away from the table, past the untouched plates of food, past the turkey now cold and forgotten, past the flickering candles that dripped wax like tears, and with each step I felt lighter, as though the chains of expectation were slipping off my shoulders. Behind me I could hear my mother sobbing louder, my father shouting, my siblings hurling accusations, but none of it reached me anymore, not in the way it once would have, because I had finally understood that blood alone does not define family, that love is measured not by what you can provide, but by how you are seen when you have nothing to give, and in this house I had never truly been seen. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the quiet was staggering after the storm, the stars above scattered and indifferent, and I stood there breathing deeply, feeling the chill against my skin, and I realized that though I had lost something, maybe the illusion of belonging, maybe the fragile comfort of tradition, I had gained something far greater, freedom. Freedom from their expectations, freedom from their manipulations, freedom to live my life without bending beneath the weight of guilt and obligation. And as I walked down the driveway, the muffled shouting fading behind me, I knew there would be consequences, that the calls and messages would come, that the guilt would be thrown at me like daggers, that the story of this night would be retold at every gathering long after I stopped attending. But I also knew I would endure, because the wealth I carried wasn't just in numbers on a screen. It was in the knowledge that I had built myself, survived myself, and chosen myself, and no matter how loudly they screamed, they could never take that away. In the quiet of that night, I understood with painful clarity that money hadn't ruined my family. it had revealed them. And though the revelation hurt, it also set me free. Thank you for staying till the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to Fractured Promises. It's free, and it gives me the motivation to bring you even more powerful stories. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have given your family the money or walked away like I did? Your opinion matters, and I love reading what you think. Until next time, stay tuned for the next story. It might just surprise you even more than this one.